The Vorath called it skethna vor, which, loosely translated from their clicking, pressure-based language, meant something between worthless drift matter and an embarrassment to metal. They were not wrong, by any standard a reasonable person might apply. The ship had no name anymore. Whatever letters had once been painted across its hull had been sandblasted away by decades of microparticle erosion. Its cargo bay doors were fused shut at uneven angles, like a mouth that had tried to close and forgotten how halfway through. 3 of its 4 engine pods were completely dead, not damaged, not malfunctioning, just gone, replaced by ugly patches of welded steel plate that someone had bolted on with the kind of confidence that only desperation produces. The 4th engine pod still ran, but barely, cycling on and off in irregular intervals like a heartbeat that couldn't decide whether to continue. It floated in Sector 9 Mirren, a stretch of deep space that sat between 2 active trade corridors and therefore belonged to neither. Salvage crews from 4 different species had already passed through this sector in the last 18 months. Each one had catalogued the freighter, tagged it as non-viable, and moved on. The Vorath team, 3 individuals built like upright crabs with translucent amber shells and eyes that processed light in rotating bands, had been the most recent. Their lead assessor, a senior salvager named Thresh Cove, had spent exactly 4 minutes aboard before declaring it a hazard to docking equipment and leaving. His official log entry read, "Human construction. Pre-expansion era. No recoverable alloys of value. No functional systems. No reason to expend resources. Recommend drift flagging and standard corridor avoidance." That log entry was transmitted on an open channel. Mara Voss heard it. She was not a salvager. She was not, technically, supposed to be in Sector 9 Mirren at all. Her research vessel, a compact, stubborn little ship called the Lindenborg, was registered for cultural archaeology work in the adjacent Pala Drift, where ancient human survey markers had been found embedded in asteroid rock a few years back. She had a permit, a small grant from the University of New Cascadia, and a crew of 2. Her research assistant Daniel Okafor and a ship's mechanic named Suki Tran who had come aboard for one job 6 months ago and simply never left. What Thresh Cove's log hadn't mentioned, because his instruments hadn't been calibrated to detect it, because Vorath salvage equipment was optimized for mass and alloy composition, not for electromagnetic residue, was the signal. It was almost nothing. Mara would later describe it as hearing a single word spoken in a library, from 3 rooms away, through a closed door, while rain hit the windows. Her long-range passive array had flagged it as anomalous and filed it in a low-priority queue. She'd almost deleted the queue without reading it. She'd been tired that evening. Daniel had made coffee badly, and the Pala Drift survey was going nowhere. But she'd read it. The signal was cycling. Not broadcasting, it wasn't strong enough for that. It was more like a system that had been designed to transmit and had been trying to do so for a very long time with almost no power left, repeating its attempt on a loop, each cycle shorter and weaker than the last. Like someone in a dark room pressing a light switch over and over, not knowing the power had been cut at the source, still hoping. Mara had stared at that readout for a long time. Then she'd told Suki to change course. Getting aboard the freighter took the better part of a day, and not because of any sophisticated defense system. The problem was more fundamental than that. The ship's outer airlock had been manually sealed from the inside, not electronically locked, not encrypted, but physically bolted using a mechanism so old that Mara initially didn't recognize what she was looking at. It was a rotary bar lock, the kind used in early space construction when engineers didn't fully trust automated systems and built manual overrides as a matter of philosophy. You needed a specific tool to turn it, a long-handled wrench with a hexagonal socket of a particular size, and that tool had almost certainly been kept inside the ship. Daniel spent 2 hours designing a makeshift version using components from the Lindenborg's repair kit. Suki spent another hour arguing that they should just cut through the hull instead. Mara spent that hour reading everything in the university's database about pre-expansion human freighter design, which wasn't much. Most records from that period had been lost or fragmentary, but it was enough to tell her one important thing. Ships from this era were built with redundancy as a core value. Not elegance. Not efficiency. Redundancy. If one system failed, there was another. If that failed, there was a manual option. If the manual option required a tool, the tool was stored somewhere logical. Somewhere the designer assumed any crew member could find it under stress, in the dark, possibly injured. She found the emergency tool cabinet on the outer hull, behind a panel marked with a simple symbol, a wrench inside a circle, that had been painted directly onto the metal rather than digitally displayed. It had been there the whole time, waiting. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that had partially degraded but held its shape, was the wrench. The airlock opened. The smell hit them first. Old air, recycled so many times it had lost any character, carrying the faint chemical trace of whatever the life support system had used as a scrubbing agent decades ago. Cold, not dangerous cold, but the specific cold of a space that had been slowly losing heat for a long time and hadn't been asked to warm itself in just as long. The interior was dim. Emergency lighting still functioned in a few sections, casting a red-orange glow that made the corridors look like the inside of something geological rather than mechanical. Dust had settled on every horizontal surface in the particular way that only happens in low-gravity environments. Fine, even layers, undisturbed. Daniel found the first datapad 3 meters inside the main corridor, sitting on a storage shelf as though someone had set it down intending to pick it up again. Its screen was dark but its casing was intact. They found 17 more over the next 4 hours, distributed throughout the ship in ways that didn't initially make sense. In the engine room, in the crew quarters, in a storage bay that should have held nothing but spare parts, tucked into a wall cavity behind a panel in the captain's room that had no obvious reason to exist. Mara recognized the distribution pattern while she was eating a protein bar in the ship's galley, looking at Daniel's map of where each pad had been located. She had seen this before, in a completely different context. It was the same principle used by certain historical human cultures to preserve knowledge during periods of conflict or collapse, the practice of distributing copies of critical information across multiple hidden locations, so that the destruction of any single location could not erase the whole. No single data pad held the complete picture. They had been scattered deliberately throughout the ship, so that even if sections of the vessel were destroyed or searched and stripped, the complete information would survive somewhere. Someone had hidden these not from salvagers or aliens. They had hidden them from time itself. The data pads powered on. That alone stopped everyone in the makeshift workspace they had set up in the freighter's galley. Suki had rigged a charging connection from the Lindenborg's power cells, expecting to spend hours coaxing dead batteries back to minimal function. Instead, every pad came online within 40 seconds of connection, screens brightening cleanly, no corrupted boot sequence, no fragmented memory. That shouldn't work this well, Suki said, and she said it with the specific tone of someone who understood exactly why something shouldn't work and was therefore more unsettled by its working than a non-expert would be. The battery chemistry was different from anything in current use. Mara photographed it and sent a query to the University Materials Archive. The response came back 6 hours later. The composition matched a formula developed during a period called the Long Preparation, a roughly 40-year stretch before humanity's first confirmed interstellar colony ship launched, when engineers had been obsessive about designing components for century-scale durability. The formula had been considered too expensive and too complex for mass production, and had eventually been abandoned in favor of cheaper alternatives. Only a handful of projects had actually used it. Projects that expected to be gone for a very long time. The navigation data was the first obstacle. The stellar cartography on the datapads used a coordinate system anchored to reference points that no longer matched current star charts, not because the stars had moved significantly, but because the reference framework itself was different, built around a set of observed pulsars that had since been recatalogued under different designations. It was like trying to navigate a modern city using a map that named every street after something the city no longer remembered. Daniel worked on the coordinate translation for 36 hours with almost no sleep, cross-referencing pulsar signatures against the university's deep archive of historical astronomical records. Mara worked alongside him, not on the navigation, but on the written logs that filled 3 of the datapads entirely. Personal entries, mission records, notes written in plain language by people who had expected these words to be read eventually and had written them accordingly. The colony's official designation was Hearthward 7. It had launched as a private settlement initiative during a period of significant political instability on Earth, funded by a coalition of groups that had disagreed with the dominant colonial policy of the time. They had not sought official registration. They had not filed a standard departure record. They had left quietly, deliberately off the books, because they believed that being found too easily would eventually mean being told what to do by people who had not made the journey. The last entry in the mission log was dated to a period roughly 230 years before the present. It was written by someone identified only as the coordinator, a title rather than a name. The entry was brief. It described a successful atmospheric reading of the destination world, a planet they had named simply Hearth, and it ended with a single line that Mara read 4 times before she could move on. "We are going to be fine. We are going to be so fine. I want whoever reads this to know that we were not afraid at the end of the journey. We were ready." The final coordinate set, assembled from fragments across all 17 datapads, each holding one piece of the complete picture, pointed to a system in a region of space that had been surveyed at long range and classified as geologically unstable and therefore not prioritized for exploration. It was, by most standards, an unremarkable destination. Which was, Mara realized, entirely the point. The Lindenborg was not built for this kind of travel. Its range was adequate for regional survey work in established corridors, where relay stations and supply points existed at reasonable intervals. The route to Hearth system passed through none of those. It was a straight line drawn across a part of the galaxy that the major spacefaring civilizations had collectively decided wasn't worth the fuel, and while the Lindenborg could theoretically make the distance, it would arrive with very little margin for anything going wrong. Mara filed a route plan with the University of New Cascadia, a formal notification that was also functionally a request for permission she was not going to wait for. She included the coordinate data and a summary of the discovery. The response she received 20 hours later, delayed by transmission distance, was cautiously enthusiastic and firmly advised waiting for a properly equipped research vessel to be commissioned, which the university estimated would take 8 to 14 months. She read the message, acknowledged receipt, and told Suki to calculate the fuel load. Suki did not argue. She had read the coordinator's log entry over Mara's shoulder. Daniel spent the first week of travel rebuilding the coordinate translation into a format the Lindenborg's navigation system could actually use, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the bridge surrounded by handwritten notes because he found that physical writing helped him think in ways that screen-based work did not. Suki ran engine diagnostics every 6 hours and fixed 3 separate minor issues that she described as things that were probably fine but now definitely are. Mara reread the datapads. She kept returning to one detail that didn't fit the rest of the mission record neatly. The freighter, the one they had found, the one Thresh Cove had called Skethen Avor, was not mentioned in any of the colonial mission documentation. The colony ship itself, the vessel that had carried the settlers to Hearth, was described in detail. The freighter was not that ship. It was something else, something that had come after, that had carried the datapads back toward the established human corridors and then, apparently, failed to complete the return journey. Someone from Hearth Ward 7 had tried to send a message home. The freighter had been the message. It had drifted for over 2 centuries, waiting to be read, cycling its faint signal loop on dying batteries that were still not quite dead, designed by engineers who had believed in building things that lasted even when no one was watching. On the 43rd day of travel, the Lindenborg's long-range sensors picked up the target system. On the 44th day, they saw Hearth. The planet was green and blue and partially cloud-covered, which was not surprising. What was surprising was the light. Not sunlight. The star in this system provided adequate illumination, nothing unusual. The light that caught Mara's attention was visible on the night side of the planet, spread across the dark hemisphere in the unmistakable pattern of a populated surface. Clusters of brightness at irregular intervals, connected by thinner lines that traced the routes between them. Not the blazing density of a major human world, not a civilization that had industrialized without restraint, but the considered, distributed glow of a settlement that had grown carefully, that had thought about where it was putting its light and why. It was, she thought, exactly what you would build if you had arrived somewhere and decided that you wanted to stay without destroying what you had found. Suki was crying and not acknowledging it. Daniel had stopped typing and was simply looking at the screen with an expression Mara didn't have a word for, something between vindication and grief, because the people who had built this place had never been found in their lifetimes, had never known whether the message they sent home had arrived. It hadn't. Not until now. The Lindenberg entered the system slowly and broadcast a contact signal on the oldest human frequency standard in its communications library, a choice Mara made instinctively on the reasoning that a civilization 200 years removed from mainstream human development might not recognize current protocols but would almost certainly have preserved the originals. They received a response in 11 minutes. The voice was human. The accent was nothing Mara had ever heard, a particular rhythm and vowel pattern that had evolved in isolation for 2 centuries, shaped by whatever linguistic pressures the community had developed, but unmistakably human in its underlying structure. The words were clear. Lindenberg, this is Hearth approach. We have you on sensors. Please confirm your point of origin and state your purpose. Mara leaned forward to the communications panel. She said, "We found your ship." There was a pause that lasted longer than transmission delay could account for. Then the voice said, very quietly, "Which one?" And Mara understood then that the freighter in Sector 9 Mirren had not been the only message Hearthward 7 had sent. It had been one of several attempts across many years, ships sent back along the original route like letters dropped into a river and trusted to the current, not knowing which if any would arrive. This community had spent generations trying to be found, quietly, without certainty, without any way to know if the effort was wasted. The last one, Mara said. A freighter. 17 datapads. We read everything. Another pause. We sent that one a long time ago. A breath. We had given up on it. Hearth from the surface was nothing like Mara had expected, which meant her expectations had been wrong in ways she found instructive about herself. She had expected, without fully articulating it, something preserved. A snapshot of 2 centuries ago human culture, frozen by isolation, like an insect in amber. What she found instead was a place that had evolved so independently and so completely that some of its social architecture required extended explanation before she could understand it, not because it was alien in any uncomfortable sense, but because it had solved problems she hadn't known were problems in ways she wouldn't have thought to try. The settlement had no central government in any form she recognized. It had something its inhabitants called the consideration system, a layered process for collective decision-making that had developed organically from the original mission's governance structure and then been revised, formally, 11 times over 2 centuries, each revision documented and preserved as part of what they called the living record. The current version was the 12th iteration, and its most distinctive feature was the explicit acknowledgement that it would eventually need to be revised again. Change was built into the structure of authority itself. The system assumed its own impermanence. The original colonists had arrived with the founders' skills and knowledge but without the founders' specific cultural context for what a successful society was supposed to look like, because many of them had left precisely because they disagreed with that context. So they had built from principles rather than templates, argued through first principles, failed at some things, succeeded at others, and kept records of both with unusual honesty. The living record was stored in a building at the center of the oldest settlement. Not a government building, not a religious building, but a library, which on Hearth was neither of those things and also somehow both. People brought the living record to it when major decisions were made. They brought disputes. They brought proposals. They brought, occasionally, grief. The librarians, a role that had evolved considerably from its original function, were trained in something between mediation and historiography, and they were among the most respected members of the community. Mara spent 3 days in that library. She was reading the record of the freighter's departure. Its crew had been 3 people. All volunteers. They had understood the probability that the ship would fail before it reached its destination. The estimates in the mission notes were frank about the odds, and they had gone anyway, because the community had agreed that if there was any chance of reconnecting with the broader human presence in the galaxy, that chance was worth 3 people's willingness to try. Their names were recorded carefully. The library held a small memorial for them, nothing elaborate, just a wall panel with their names and a single line that someone had added years after their departure when it became clear they weren't coming back. They went as far as they could. The Vorath received the report 14 weeks after Mara's first contact with Hearth, transmitted through the university's official channels with a full data package attached. Thresh Cove was not named in the report. His salvage log was cited as evidence of how close the discovery had come to not happening, not as a criticism. The report was careful to note, because his assessment of the freighter as non-viable had been reasonable given standard salvage evaluation protocols. The point wasn't that he had been wrong by the standards of his profession. The point was that the standards of his profession were calibrated for a particular kind of value, and the freighter had contained a different kind entirely. This distinction, obvious in retrospect, genuinely difficult before the fact, produced more discussion than the discovery itself in certain circles. The Vorath Assessors Guild issued a measured public statement acknowledging the oversight and noting that their scanning protocols would be reviewed for sensitivity to low-power electromagnetic anomalies. This was a reasonable institutional response. It was also, Mara thought, slightly beside the point. The issue wasn't instrument sensitivity. The issue was that Thresh Cove's evaluation had begun with a conclusion: human construction, pre-expansion era, no value, and the instruments had confirmed it, because the instruments were asked to look for things consistent with the conclusion rather than things inconsistent with it. It was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of question. She wrote this in a paper that the university published 7 months later. It was not about the Vorath, or about alien assumptions regarding humanity, or about any of the things people expected her to write about. It was about the methodology of inquiry itself, about what you find when you look for what you expect versus what you find when you allow for the possibility that your expectations are the variable most in need of examination. The paper was widely read in academic circles. Several Vorath scholars responded thoughtfully. A Kethmiran epistemologist, from a species whose cognitive architecture approached the question from an entirely different angle, wrote a response that Mara considered more interesting than her original paper, and they corresponded for 2 years afterward. The discovery of Hearth got more attention. But Mara always privately believed the paper was the more important thing. 6 months after first contact, a properly equipped research vessel arrived at Hearth with a full team of historians, linguists, and cultural anthropologists. Mara was asked to join the mission as a consultant. She agreed, on the condition that Daniel and Suki were credentialed as full team members rather than support staff, which after some administrative friction was arranged. The historical team's primary interest was the freighter itself, not the datapads, which had already been extensively analyzed, but the ship as a physical artifact, the decisions embedded in its construction, the story written in its materials and design choices. What they found, working with engineers from Hearth who had grown up maintaining technology descended from the original colony ship, was that the freighter had been significantly modified before its departure. The ugly welded hull patches that had made it look so derelict were not damage. They were intentional. The non-functional engine pods were not failed systems. They had been deliberately disabled and their power rerouted to a concealed secondary system that ran the signal loop and maintained the battery charge on the datapads. The ship had been designed to look like abandoned wreckage. It had been designed to drift, to be dismissed, to be overlooked by anyone who might have reason to intercept it. Hearth Ward 7's founders had left because they didn't want to be controlled. 200 years of maintaining that independence had refined that instinct into something more considered, a genuine philosophical position about the relationship between information and power, about who should know where you are and why, about the difference between being connected and being visible. They had sent the freighter not despite the likelihood of it being ignored, but partly because of it. A valuable ship would have been salvaged. A claimed ship would have been searched. A junk ship drifting in low-priority space would be logged and forgotten, which meant it would keep moving, which meant eventually, if the batteries held, if the signal reached the right instrument on the right frequency on the right night, it might find someone who was listening for something other than what everyone else was listening for. It had taken 230 years. But it had worked. The question of what Hearth's reconnect ion with the broader human presence would mean took years to develop an answer. And the answer, when it emerged, was less dramatic than most observers had predicted. There was no absorption. Hearth did not become a standard human world with standard human institutions grafted onto it. The consideration system remained. The living record remained. The librarians remained. The community had spent 2 centuries building something that worked for them, and they were not interested in trading it for convenience or recognition. What changed was smaller and in some ways more significant. Students began traveling between Hearth and established human universities in both directions, Hearth students going out to study fields the colony hadn't had resources to develop, outside students coming to Hearth to study fields the colony had developed in ways no one else had tried. The exchange was asymmetrical in interesting ways. The consideration system attracted serious academic attention. Several of its features were eventually adapted, partially, imperfectly, with varying results, by communities dealing with governance challenges in other parts of human space. The 3 crew members of the freighter were formally recognized in the historical record. Their names were added to a memorial at New Cascadia University. Hearth held a ceremony that Mara attended, standing in the library where their names had been kept for 2 centuries, listening to a community remember people it had never stopped remembering. The freighter itself was preserved exactly where it had been found, in Sector 9 Mirren, in the drift. Hearth's community voted on this, using the consideration system, and the decision was clear and immediate. The ship had done its work there. It had waited there. It should stay there. A small marker was placed on its hull, not large enough to change its silhouette, not bright enough to change its appearance from a distance. Just a plaque, attached where the name had once been sandblasted away, engraved with the names of the 3 crew members and the name they had called their home. From Hearth. Going as far as we could. Mara visited it one more time before she moved on to other work. She floated outside in a suit, reading the plaque, thinking about the engineers who had built batteries designed to outlast their own era, and the 3 people who had trusted those batteries, and the community that had voted to send them, and the 2 centuries of quiet waiting in between. She thought about Thresh Cove's 4 minutes aboard, and her own 3 seconds of almost deleting a low-priority file, and how close none of this had come to happening. Then she went back inside the Lindenberg, and told Suki to take them home.